Hey ghouls and gals, welcome back to my channel. My name is Taylor and today's video is a very exciting one. Today I am going to be talking about my top 10 favorite books that I've read in 2023. 2023, hell of a year for reading. I read a lot. I read a lot of really good books. It was really hard to narrow down these books into just my top 10. So we're going to be going through my top 10 books I read this year in no particular order because trust me, it was hard enough to just narrow my list down to 10. So I've got a good variety of genres, good variety of stories on here. I can't wait to talk about them and gush about them with you all. So let's just get started with the first book, which is The Reformatory by Tananarive Due. The Reformatory is historical horror and it's set in Jim Crow, Florida. We're following our protagonist, Robert Stevens Jr. He's sent to a segregated reform school after a white boy and the son of the largest landowner in town is being very creepy towards his older sister, Gloria. Robbie steps in, he gets punished for this, and he is sent to this reformatory. When Robbie is there, he not only realizes that the horrors come from the haints of the young children that haunt the land of the reformatory, previous young boys who have lived at the reformatory and died under mysterious circumstances, but also there is something very sinister going on at the reformatory. This book follows both Robbie and his experiences at the reformatory and his older sister Gloria as she entangles with a very corrupt justice system to try and get him out. This one I'm specifically recommending via audiobook. It is narrated by Jonice Abbott Pratt and she just does an absolutely wonderful job. This is storytelling at its finest, quite honestly, and the only regret I have about reading this book at the end of 2023 is that I have not picked up anything by Tananarive Due before 2023. This really has everything that I love exploring in horror. I love a good historical horror. I love family-focused horror and especially exploring through a paranormal lens real-life horrors. The Reformatory is going to give you the chills. There are some creepy scenes in here, both paranormal and just this is one of those books where even though there are ghosts on the page, it's a paranormal book. The true horror is the Jim Crow South and the establishments that continuously fail young children in society, young Black children in society. So keep in mind this one is a very heavy read, but I cannot recommend it enough. If you like historical horror that really packs an emotional punch, then you definitely are going to want to pick up The Reformatory by Tananarive Due. I am so excited to pick up more by this author in 2024. The next book I want to talk about today is A Long Time Dead by Samara Breger. This is a vampire story at its most romantic, its most gothic, its most lush. It's really about, it takes place in 1837 and it's a character study about the lengths in which two vampires go to secure a love that cannot die and find love in each other. The story starts, Poppy, our main character, wakes up. She has been turned into a vampire. She has no idea how this has happened, but she is being taken care of by another vampire named Roisin. Both of these new vampires have been turned by the same vampire who has just up and left Roisin to teach Poppy the ropes and to have them struggle together in teaching Poppy the ins and outs of how to be a vampire. This is a very character-driven story. There is obviously like an action plot and a action-focused plot, but most of the story, most of what I love about this story comes from just the wonderful characterizations, the wonderful found family, and just what I love about vampire stories. It does take place in like the 1830s is when it starts, but you really get to see how vampirism really benefits a group of people, especially I think pretty much all of our main characters in this found family of vampires that we follow throughout the story are queer, and just finding avenues where, you know, they do have to give up their humanity, they do have to give up, you know, eating and watching people around them die as they never grow old, but kind of getting to reclaim agency in a period of society where if you were a woman, if you were not white, if you were queer, it was very hard to have any agency. And I just thought that was so fun. And I loved getting to see this found family dynamic of these vampires really trying to live their best in situations and in time periods where if they were human, they probably wouldn't be able to. This is also just such like a beautiful love story between Poppy and Roisin as they fall in love with each other and try and figure out how to navigate falling in love, and creating a safe and healthy relationship because both of them have been hurt in the past. They've both come from abusive pasts, so just finding the joy and finding love together again. I just thought this was an absolutely wonderful story. So if you like gothic tales, if you like romantic vampire sapphic romance with, of course, also some bloodshed because it is a vampire story, definitely check out A Long Time Dead by Samara Breger. I really enjoyed this one. Next up, we have, I think, the only contemporary fiction on this list, but it's from an author who has always made it to my top books of the year, and that would be Yellowface by R.F. Kuang. This one also, I'm specifically recommending the audiobook narrated by Helen Laser. I think that is really, you're really gonna get something extra out of the story if you listen to the audiobook. But this follows author June Hayward and to some extent her best frenemy, Athena Liu. They're supposed to be twin rising stars. They're both in the same year at Yale. They both published at the same time, but Athena really rose to stardom and June didn't even get a paperback release of her book's release. So even though they are kind of friends, it's a very tense dynamic here. When June witnesses the freak accident death of Athena Liu, and she has the opportunity, she finds Athena Liu's unpublished manuscript. June edits Athena's work, sends it off as her own, publishes it under an ethnically ambiguous pseudonym, and she starts reaping the benefits and the rewards of what is, she believes, her work because she has edited this manuscript to kind of make it her own. But June can't step away from Athena's shadow that easily because as the story starts coming to light about how this book potentially wasn't June's but Athena's all along, we start to see our main character June have a downward spiral as she races to protect her secret and how far she'll go to protect what she believes is rightfully hers. I feel like you see all the time like books that are described as razor sharp or cuttingly funny or cutting edge satire, like all of these really describe Yellowface. This was, when I was listening to it, at some parts my jaw was on the ground because the audacity of our main character. June is a very interesting person to sit and listen to her perspective and to see the way she rationalizes things. It's a story that really, really makes you think. It tackles questions of diversity, racism, cultural appropriation, all of those like very hot button, hot ticket topics in publishing and in the arts as a whole. I feel like at the moment, every single thing that R.F. Kuang has written, I've absolutely loved. She keeps refining and honing her craft in just new and creative ways, and I'm so excited to see what she comes out with next. But this one, you're definitely going to want to pick up the audiobook because listening to June tell you her story is just so fascinating and really a story. It's truly the definition of a train wreck that you cannot look away from, like the narrative in this story and June's self-sabotage of herself and everything that happens in the novel. It's a train wreck. You can't look away from it, but you can't stop looking away until the very last page. Next up, we have A Day of Fallen Night by Samantha Shannon. This is the standalone prequel to The Prayer of the Orange Tree, another one of my all-time favorite books. This is epic fantasy at its finest. It's exploring the power of women, the struggle against ancient evil, in a very queer-friendly and just lush and super imaginative world. We're following multiple women in very different positions of power, whether it be a sister at the priory or the Queen of Innis, as they have to fight to protect their people against the Dreadmount, an end of days horror that they never thought would happen. They thought it was something out of a myth, but the Dreadmount erupts. There are wyverns and evil beasts everywhere attacking the continent, attacking cities, people, everything, their whole civilization. It's the end of days, and through this era of terror and violence, our main characters have to figure out in their own respective ways how to protect humankind, the ones they love, their families, their countries, and all of humankind from this devastating threat. I loved this. I was not sure that any standalone fantasy book, because these are standalone books, you can read this one or The Prayer of the Orange Tree and not pick up another one, but I highly recommend picking up both because this world is just so immersive. I did not think that I would love this as much as I love Priory, but honestly, I think I might like it more. Samantha Shannon knows how to write some absolutely badass women characters, but not necessarily like stereotypical what you might think of as like a badass female character in a fantasy setting, because we do follow several different perspectives and they all have very different ideas of how to bring about peace, what to do to fix this situation, to fight this situation, and just the different cultures and everything in this world is just so incredible. And I always, when I pick up this book, when I pick up Prayer of the Orange Tree, I am immersed in a completely different world. Like the world of the Prayer of the Orange Tree feels like a real world, and I just think this series, that's one of the incredible things about it, because not only are the characters incredible, and it's a very, very magical creature heavy. If you want dragon fantasy at its finest, you gotta check out these books. The worlds and the characters feel so real and so grounded in reality that even though there are dragon battles and wyvern battles and all of these magical, mystical things happening, it feels like a story that's just so real because of the characterizations that Samantha Shannon is able to create. So if you have not read Prayer of the Orange Tree, I'd recommend maybe picking this one up, because I do think I like it a little bit more than Priory. I want to reread maybe both of them in 2024, but I just had an absolutely wonderful time. The Roots of Chaos series is truly like a masterclass in fantasy for me, and I absolutely can't say enough good things about this series. This is the series that brought me back into reading like heavy epic fantasy, so absolutely could not recommend enough. Next up, we have Our Share of Night by Mariana Enriquez. This is translated by Megan McDowell. This is a family saga wrapped in a horror novel. This is about a woman's mysterious death that puts her husband and son on a collision course with her demonic family that may or may not have caused her death. This story moves back and forth in time, and the way it's told and the eyes through which you see the events happening, from London in the 1960s to Argentina's military dictatorship. And we are primarily following Gaspar, who is the son in the synopsis that I mentioned earlier. His father is the one raising him. He has been keeping so many secrets. His mother died under very mysterious circumstances when Gaspar was really young. His father always keeps them on the run from a mysterious family who is not just a family, but a cult who claims to have unlocked the key to immortality, but it may or may not be a perfect immortality that people might want to have. So it's a family saga. It's a story about father and son running away from a cult. At times, it's like a haunted house story where the house is Gaspar himself almost. And we're also following, for sections of it, because we're following Gaspar from when he was a child to an adult, jumping back and forth in time. So we're following a haunting family legacy of just secrets and trauma and potentially magical powers that Gaspar may or may not have, which may or may not be why his family actually wants to get in contact with him. It's a lot. It's a wild ride. It's not just a ghost story. It's not just like a cult story. It's not a story just about a cult. It's all these things wrapped into one, but it's also like a beautiful family saga about just love and what we do to protect the ones we love. So if you are looking for a deep dive into a very unconventional family, about a very cursed inheritance and all of the sacrifices that a father makes for his son to protect his son, definitely check out Our Share of Night. Next up on my list, I have Masters of Death by Olivie Blake, another author that very frequently winds up now on my best of lists. Masters of Death is an incredibly character-driven story. Our cast of characters are all fantastical cryptids or creatures of fairy tales about the game that the immortals play. And there's only one rule in this game, and that is do not lose. For example, one of our main characters, Viola, is not only a struggling real estate agent, but also a vampire. She's trying to sell a house, But the big problem is that this house is haunted. The ghost haunting the mansion has been murdered, and until he can solve the mystery of how exactly he died, he refuses to move on. So Viola hires Fox Demora, who is a medium, a little bit of a fraud, but he can actually see and communicate with the dead because he is the godson of death. So she hires him. He discovers that the occupant, the murder that took place in the house, has a lot more high cosmic stakes than anyone was anticipating. So Viola and Fox and a whole bunch of their other cryptid friends, got angels, demons, devil, like every sort of thing you can think of, they all band together to play this mysterious game to try and solve this mystery that may or may not have bigger ramifications for the afterlife. This one is incredibly character driven. I love Olivie Blake. She's one of my favorite authors, but they're definitely not for people who don't enjoy character driven stories. They are so much more character forward than external plot forward. So this one especially, I think, is a great example of that. It's more about the characterization and the character development, and the plot is definitely more internal than external. So if you do not like that, this is very, very heavy character driven. So that would be my only caveat, but I absolutely loved this one. It was not the only Olivie Blake book that I read this year, but it was by far my favorite. I love the characters. They felt so real. I love them. I can't believe this is a standalone. I mean, I do think it ends off pretty perfectly, but I just love the characters that we are introduced to in here, and I just love like the urban and supernatural sort of fantastical blend that Olivie Blake is really good at. So if you like character-driven fantasy with magical creatures like angels, vampires, ghosts, ghost hunters, godsons of death, demigods, all of that rolled into one chaotic story with amazing characters, you're definitely going to want to check out Masters of Death by Olivie Blake. Next up, we have The September House by Carissa Orlando. And this is about our main character, Margaret, who is determined to stay in her dream home, even after it becomes abundantly clear that it is absolutely a nightmare. Margaret and her husband Hal move into this large Victorian house. It's for sale at an incredibly reasonable price. It's their dream home. It's the home they want to retire in. However, during the month of September, it is full Amityville horror in there. There are ghosts everywhere. There's blood leaking down from the walls. It's like the last 20 minutes of a horror movie for the whole entire month of September. Hal decides after a couple of years living at the house that this is not for him, and he leaves, but doesn't tell anyone where he's going. Margaret decides to stay at the house because this is her home. She's not leaving her home. She learns to like cohabitate with the ghosts and is determined not to give up her house. However, their daughter starts becoming very, very worried that Hal hasn't reached out to anybody, and it seems very out of character for him to just up and leave Margaret, who, you know, they've been together for about 30-ish years at this point. So Margaret's daughter comes to try and solve the disappearance of Hal and also to stay at this house during the month of September. So Margaret has to try her darndest to not only figure out where her husband has gone, keep her daughter from realizing how crazy this house gets in the month of September, and then also maybe after all of that is done, figure out why the house is the way it is and maybe get some of those ghosts out of the way. This is such like a wild premise. It's also very funny at times because we see Margaret, who it's very clear from like the very first chapter, this house is haunted. She interacts with the ghosts on a day-to-day basis, and you just see her so accustomed to all of these sights. And this book is definitely not is the house haunted or is it not haunted? Like, the ghosts are there. You're seeing Margaret deal with them, and as her daughter moves in with her and they're trying to solve this disappearance, and you kind of get more background onto why Margaret is the way it is, it just turns into a kind of funny like haunted house story to a very deeply emotional exploration of relationships and why people stay in all sorts of situations. So this is one where I feel like I cannot believe it was a debut book. Like, it just from start to finish was just such a fascinating, very atmospheric story. Save this one for September. I think you're really gonna love it. It's like the perfect paranormal ghost haunted house story. I love haunted house stories. It's one of my favorite subgenres in horror, and this book is definitely one of the best. It's a haunting mystery that really delves into interpersonal relationships and trauma and not necessarily paranormal ghosts, but also just mental trauma as well and how that manifests. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, I'd highly recommend The September House. The next book on my top books of 2023 is Monstrilio by Gerardo, Sámano, Córdova. And this is kind of in the same realm, I would say, of Frankenstein. It's not a Frankenstein retelling, but it's in that kind of same wavelength, it being an exploration of grief, where it's a horror, explores grief, family, bringing things back from the dead, and just like the complexities of love and loyalty and what you will do to keep your family together. We're following a family where their 11-year-old son tragically passes away. In her grief, the mother, Magos, cuts off a piece of her son Santiago's lung and takes care of it in accordance to an old folk tale she has heard of before, to bring people back from the dead. And she does bring something back from the dead. It is not Santiago, it's something else. And as it grows, it starts off as a piece of lung, and it grows from something that's like a little monster to something that is more humanoid, and that is our titular character, Monstrilio. And we're following this family and Monstrilio as they raise him, both as a replacement for the son that they lost, and as they realize this is not going to be their son Santiago, I'm trying to figure out what taking care of something like Monstrilio actually looks like. And this book was so heart-wrenching. Obvious trigger warnings for this one. If you cannot deal with child death, that is a theme about it. Very first page, Santiago dies, and we're seeing his parents try to cope with the unimaginable loss of their 11-year-old son, and those themes of loss and replacement and trying to move on, or, you know, pick up the pieces of your life, move forward after something so horrible has happened. It's just such a deeply emotional and powerful book about a family who are all grieving, and to not only lose your son, but to lose the relationships that you have had, because it's a strain on Santiago and then Monstrilio's parents, because they have very different ideas about Monstrilio from the start of his conception and everything. And just following different characters in Monstrilio's life, as well as Monstrilio, to kind of examine just the ramifications that such a huge loss can have on a family, and the reverberations of that, and generational loss, and just the impact of that loss for decades to come. So this book made me so sad. It made me cry. It's so beautiful. Again, I think this is a debut. This is just an out of the park debut, and it is horror, but it is also just like deeply haunting and sad. I think if you like the themes in Mike Flanagan's work that he does so well, that blends horror with family obligation and complex family relationships, I think you'd really love Monstrilio. Just go into it knowing that it is a very dark book, but a very beautiful book. Next up on my list is the book that's making me realize I think about half of my favorite books of the year were vampire or undead creature adjacent, but that would be Court of the Undying Seasons by A.M. Strickland. I believe this is the only new adult book on this list. It is a dark fantasy, and we're following 19-year-old Finn, who volunteers to take her secret love's place in their village's finding. Those who are a part of their finding are taken to Castle Quartzheart, which is a vampire school where you as a human either succeed and become a vampire, or fail and spend the rest of your life as a human thrall. That is, if you even survive enough through all the courses to become either. Finn volunteers to go to Castle Quartzheart, not because they want to be a vampire or because they're craving like the power and prestige from a human that becomes a vampire, but her mother was taken away and killed by vampires a long time ago, and so she is now so determined to go to the castle, learn more about vampires, figure out how to kill vampires, and solve the mystery of her mother's disappearance and avenge her mother. As Finn goes through vampire training, Finn realizes that, you know, maybe some prejudices and maybe just, you know, the vampire courts and the intrigue and just different factions of vampires are not all bloodthirsty monsters as Finn suspects that they were, but there's something going on there. And then there's also a plot going on that may or may not be tied in with her mother's disappearance, but also has to deal with the vampire courts, and then not only the balance of the vampire courts, but the human world as well. So it's a little bit of a murder mystery. There's some intrigue in there. It's essentially like a vampire Hunger Games, honestly, for a large part of it. So if you're intrigued in like trials and people going through trials, and you know, Finn is trying to go through these trials to become a vampire, because it's either become a vampire, become a thrall, which is worse than death, or die. So this is just so much fun. Darker fantasy. It is a standalone. I wish it weren't, because I feel like the world building is so cool that we could have explored so much more, because the different vampire courts and the castle courts are, and just the different vampire abilities and everything were just so cool to explore. The world building super cool. So this is like vampires that is like a good mix of like monstrous vampires, and also like there's some flirtation, there's some romance in there. This is also a very queer friendly world, at least where the vampires are involved. So if you like queer vampires, you're gonna want to check this out. It was just very, very fun. I've read a couple of things by Strickland now, and they do such a good job of combining like fantasy elements and horror elements and just making dark paranormal sort of fantasy that is just so engaging to read. And then last but not least, we have Speaking Bones by Ken Liu, and this is the 4th book in the Dandelion Dynasty series. So obviously don't read this unless you've read the other 3 books, but this series is one of the greatest fantasy series that I have ever read, and just in terms of its depth and what it explores. I know this is a very weird way to pitch a book, but it almost feels like a fictionalized history of a real life continent and like a real dynasty, because it is so in depth. You really get to explore the Nakara Empire and the different nations, the different peoples, the different cultures. You're following through these 4 books, and I think all of the books are like 600 pages plus. This last one is over 1,000 pages, and you don't just follow main characters, you follow the continent as a whole, and you follow the dynasties and the rise and fall of empires, and just there is like a family that you do focus on throughout the storyline, but you also get one-shots of just random people in the empire, from the very lowest of the low in society, like the very homeliest peasant, to the leader of a nation. You get to follow and see just what's going on in their mind. You're following not only like revolutions, because the first book does start off with a very, I feel, standard fantasy premise where there is a corrupt government and there is a rebellion that overthrows it, but our 2 main characters, they have very different ideas of what empire means and how to rule a nation. And you explore, it's not just the story of that rebellion, but then, you know, you go on and just explore just this entire history of this people, whereas now in like the 4th book, the events of the 1st book are like being retold in stories and mythology pretty much, and like tall tales and legends, and you're just exploring just this wonderfully massive tome that feels like a real place. It feels like a real people. You are just so incredibly immersed. Like, you are not only exploring the politics and like the military aspects, but you're also experiencing like the engineering developments and like political machinations. It is an absolutely massive series, and it's one you want to take your time with, because I think it took me like over a year to consume all of these, because the story is so massive and you're following generations of families and generations of this continent and just their struggles through rebellions, through civil wars, through attacks from foreign nations, and just exploring and seeing an entire people. It's so cool. I definitely would not recommend this for beginners to adult fantasy because it is just so in-depth. I feel like each book, just the scope of it, the scale of it gets more and more grandiose, and it's wonderful. It was such, I've never read anything else like it. You're not only following characters, like you're following an entire nation, and just exploring like this nation's history, and you're getting to see, you know, because some things, you know, even like rebellions or things that make people's lives better, you don't get to immediately reap those benefits as the people who participate in the rebellion. You know, you have to see like generations down the line, and years down the line, what that looks like, and you know, is the rebellion, does it hold up? Just if you like fantasy, and if you want to become so entrenched in a world where you get to explore everything from like the food, the culture, the music, there's different pantheons and ways of worship, and just everything is so all-encompassing. This is just such a fascinating series to read. So this one definitely, I thought it was absolutely a wonderful conclusion to the series, which obviously is what you want when you invest, because I think except for the first book, they're all 1,000 pages. So if you read several thousand pages of a story, you want it to stick that landing, and this absolutely does. I can't quite think of another fantasy series that has evoked that real world, like you feel like you're reading a history or historical fiction about things that actually happened, about just entire cultures and peoples that you feel like are real. So yeah, if you're looking for the first one, I would definitely say focuses most on military aspects. So if you are looking for a very political military fantasy that also goes deep into the later books, I think focus a lot more on culture and societal and political ramifications of like the military things that happen in the first couple of books, I think you'd really love this series. It's an absolute marvel of a series, and I don't think I'll ever read anything quite like the Dandelion Dynasty. So there you have it. Those are my top 10 books of 2023. I really had fun talking about them. It was really a good year. Definitely a very vampire focused year now that I'm looking at all of them back to back to back. Read a lot of good horror, read a lot of good emotional, almost literary horror. I feel like there's a lot of running themes throughout these 10 books, but I obviously would absolutely recommend these books to anyone, because out of the over 100 books I read last year, these 10 were the obvious standouts. So thank you all so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up. Leave a comment down below. Let me know your favorite books of last year. Let me know if we had any in common. Subscribe to my channel for all of the cozy gaming and bookish content. Stay safe, stay spooky, and I will see y'all in the next video. Bye!